I think the point you made is a really good one, that going into this industry, you want to be a creative problem solver and someone who knows how to look at a challenge and sift through it and find creative solutions. You probably also want to be a good writer, a great communicator, but there are so many different roles you can play within this arena, through digital, through truly just writing, through podcasting, through the consulting work we do. But if you're someone who can solve problems and find creative solutions, you're going to have a route somewhere within all those different avenues.
Welcome to Being Understood, a podcast where we explore what it means to be understood and talk to communicators who help their organizations do that. I am joined today by my co-host, Bess. Hi, Bess.
Hey, Liz. How are you?
Good. Happy to be here with you guys.
Awesome. And joining us also is our colleague, Jason.
Thanks for having me, you guys.
Yeah. Welcome.
We're excited to talk to you today.
Yes.
I'm pumped too after seeing the first couple episodes.
Thank you. Well, you have a lot of professional experience in this way, so hopefully we can, last Moses, learn some more from you as well.
More comfortable with like a headset, but
Well, we can get you one. We can pause and get you one. Okay, so Jason, you've been with Thunheim for how many years?
5.5 now.
Okay, and what do you do at Thunheim?
A lot of different things.
Okay.
And it's changed over time, right? I think everything comes back to storytelling and communicating in one way or another. But when I started, I was doing just a lot of writing and media relations, and that's turned into project managing, helping out with our management consulting projects and interviewing key stakeholders, getting into our digital arm and managing website content and all kinds of different things. So it's part of the exciting part of working here is how many different ways I get to use that communication skill set to better serve our clients.
That's awesome. And part of what I love about working here too. Talk a little bit more about your background and kind of more breadth of experience, because you have some side hustles that you do too that are, I think, part of the makeup of your experience as well.
Yeah. So for starters, I went to school to study journalism and specifically sports journalism, growing up a big sports aficionado and athlete. But I figured out pretty quickly I wasn't going to be a beat reporter covering a team for a newspaper. I wasn't going to be a TV anchor reporter. But I gravitated to a couple of things. One, obviously this PR and strategic communications field, but also sports play-by-play and calling the actual games, where you get to integrate that storytelling, narratives, and player coach backgrounds into the broadcast that fans really care about watching the game, right? That's what matters most to them. And so that's something I continue to do while continuing to figure out the strategic comms and brand reputation and digital marketing, everything else we do here.
And there's one other thing that you have a lot of experience in, which is this podcasting, as we just alluded to. And you do some of that as well related to your sports journalism, right?
A little bit. Most of my podcasting has been here at Thunheim at this point. Between a couple podcasts we've launched in the past year within the home care space and legal space. And David Erickson, our digital ace, is kind of the mastermind behind everything that we do digitally to make those succeed. But I do a lot in planning the outline for each podcast, producing it as we actually execute it, and then directing all the traffic to make sure that it gets up and running.
Yeah. Well, as Liz and I have kind of experienced already in our short time, it's not super easy to get a podcast up and running. So what do you think are some of the biggest challenges?
The starting blocks for us were figuring out who's your audience, who do you need to reach, and then what do you need to tell them, and why is it important? It's a tricky thing to figure out with a podcast. I think a lot of people think what they have to talk about is instantly interesting to everyone, but you got to make it interesting for the people who need to know it. And making sure that you have the right amount of content. We could talk on and on forever, right, about strategic comms, but you want to hammer home your points right away, because the amount of time that people are willing to watch or listen at home is getting smaller and smaller. and smaller. And so that's something that we try to focus on in the podcast that we work on here, is getting to the point right away and keeping things interesting for the amount of time that you can capture your audience's attention for.
Man, there's podcasts on anything and everything, as we all know. What are some of your favorite podcasts that you like to listen to?
I'm a news junkie too,
Yeah.
automatically from working here. So I spend a lot of time listening to the New York Times daily podcast. In the sports and pop culture realm, I'll be listening to the Dan Le Batard show, based out of Miami. And they just kind of cover all things that span from sports to the political realm. So I have a variety of things, and local podcasts, K-Fan sometimes, but mostly for the Initials game. I think that's kind of fun to tune into in the car. That's most of my podcast listening.
Yeah, I think it's a good segue into how broad channels have become and how targeted they've become. And part of that allure of certain podcasts and why targeting is so important, who is it for, is that if you're trying to talk to everybody, you're not talking to anyone. And so talk about how you've experienced this with clients and how you try to guide clients around targeting. The point of this podcast, of course, being about being understood, and a way that Thunheim spends a lot of time around that is around targeting. So how do you help your clients think about and understand how they need to think about their audiences in order to reach the right people?
Yeah.
Or who needs to know it?
It comes back to what's going to make a difference in your audience's life. Not what makes a difference for you or your coworkers, but really makes a difference for them in their day-to-day that they need to hear. And for some clients, that's easier to figure out than others. Working in the home care space, there's a lot of different things that could change for home care service programs and benefits that can be accessed and so forth for not only like clients and caregivers, but their family at large. And so some clients are constantly thinking about what those people are going to need. And that makes it pretty easy for us to figure out exactly what's going to go into the podcast.
So podcasts aside, just so the title of our podcast is, of course, Being Understood. So one thing we've been asking everyone that gets to sit in the hot seat like you are now is, what does it mean to be understood to you?
Yeah. This is kind of stealing a Pat Milanism. I know he usually talks about this being part of brand, but that gut feeling you get when you hear about something, and most of being understood is being able to reiterate what something is or what it means. But I think there's also an element of, if you really understand somebody or something, an organization, a client, like you have that gut feeling when you hear that name of that company or organization. So I think it's making sure that your audience understands, the top line bullets of who you are and what you're about. And once those things are coming across, then they should also have that feeling when they hear your name.
Why do you think it's hard to be understood for clients today?
There are millions and millions of voices out there telling you different things about each and everything. And so even if you're telling the world this is who I am and what I'm about, or what our organization does, there are probably other people who have every little nook and cranny of the internet to tell the world that, no, that's not what they're about, or this is my experience. And I'm sure each of our clients and every organization wants to serve everyone to the best of their abilities, but that doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. And you're always going to have some detractors who want to tear away from that reputation or understanding of who you are.
Which sometimes it can be challenging to help clients understand that their biggest issue right now is the fact that they're not understood. So when you found yourself in that position, if you have found yourself in that situation, like, how have you helped clients understand that actually their biggest problem is that they're not understood right now?
That's a great point. I feel like a lot of the instances I've dealt with is instead we're reminding clients, this is one person. This is not representative of your entire audience. If eventually the waters rise and you're getting that same message from tons and tons of your clients or your audience, then we have to have a conversation about you not being understood. But it's often kind of the flip side of telling them, maybe you are understood by this audience, and this is just one person. The few instances I can think of where they weren't understood is they came into working with us knowing that was part of the issue. And so they are all ears when we get into talking with some of their most vital stakeholders and gathering their assessments. And they come back and say, I didn't know that you guys offered this service, or I didn't know this was part of your mission. And when we regurgitate that to them and provide recommendations, that's all they want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, another piece of work that I know you've done extensively here is part of the listening that we do for clients that is part of research and gathering voices and gathering information from key stakeholder audiences that help us lead through to developing ways to bridge those gaps. When you're helping a client ask those kinds of questions, have you encountered those times where they aren't comfortable with what they're hearing, or that you're able to see a big aha happen because they've heard something that maybe they've thought about, but having someone else say it made it more constructive for them to do something about it? How have you seen those insights that come in impact the work that you then get to go on and do for clients?
Yeah, I think what's most insightful or compelling to clients in situations like that is when we take direct quotes from those conversations with stakeholders who usually they can't have a totally transparent conversation with, because we're coming in and saying you'll be anonymous. They know who we're talking to. We know that we're talking to this group of people who are very important to their success. But exactly what you say won't be attributed to your name. And so I think when you take that barrier down, you're going to get some information that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. And when we go into a presentation of key findings or recommendations and put those quotes up on a screen in a PowerPoint, and they actually see them and read them as opposed to a conversation, that'll make you sit back in your seat and say, oh,
yeah,
someone who's really important to us is saying that. Okay, we got to take this into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of the methodology that we bring to clients around being understood, that it's important to our process that it starts with listening and then bringing a lot of strategy and thought around then how do you use what you've heard. And you've gotten to be a part of a lot of exciting projects like that.
Yeah. So you've been here 5.5 years, you said? So I've been here 2, and there have been a lot of changes in the 2 years that I've been here. What would you say are some of the biggest changes over the 5.5 years you've been here, as far as, helping your clients be understood, just communicating in general?
I think the lengths that we go to support media in building stories and telling stories has grown a lot. I was listening to a few of your first couple episodes about how the news industry has changed, especially within TV broadcast, and fewer resources, fewer personnel. And that's kind of where we've come in, as far as before you might just send a pitch with a proposed story. And now that pitch, you want to have a lot more tools and assets for them to work with, whether it's images, B-roll, graphics, links to figures and numbers that prove the story that you want to tell. And it's not that we weren't using those things before, but they've become a lot more vital now than they were 5 years ago.
And I think just building those relationships too with different reporters or producers or editors, where they know that if you reach out about a story, you're going to be giving them so many details that they do not have to spend hours researching. So they're more likely to, listen to you when you do come to them with a pitch. And I think that's super helpful. That's something when I worked in news, I would have loved if PR professionals did that. It would have made my job so much easier. But back then, people had more time to kind of dig around and look for those extra details or look for that extra video or those pictures to complete the story. So it's definitely changed a lot.
Yeah, it puts more pressure on us to have really thought through all angles of a story, but I think that's the benefit. We bring objectivity to those clients. And that story, like, that's a great story, but here's what we think we need on top of it in order to help make that case. And I think also helping depersonalize the process a little bit. Media have more stories to file, less time to do it. Sometimes, even if it's a great story, the other things going on that day dictate whether it becomes a story or not. And that doesn't mean that it's not a great story, but we might need to keep thinking about what's the best way to position this so that it works for this media outlet or whatever. But do you guys find that you're spending a lot more time on that, trying to help clients with their storyboard, if you will? That's how I think about it, like the pieces.
Yeah, I think sometimes you remind them that patience can be a virtue in this space, even though sometimes the story is urgent, it's breaking news. Usually it's not hard to tell it then and get it into the media because they recognize that too. But sometimes they're wondering, why don't we have coverage yet? And here are other things that are happening in our local market that are really important right now to the general audience. But maybe that won't be true in 2 days, and we'll have new opportunities open up because this story still is relevant for an ongoing period of time. There are some stories that are evergreen that you could tell at any moment in time.
Yeah, so sometimes it doesn't even have to do with the angle of the pitch or anything. It's just waiting for that opportune time for when reporters aren't so busy covering that day of news. I mean, I remember working with a client and we had a really great story to tell, but it was also at the same time when Russia was invading Ukraine. And so helping them understand that it's not that they don't have an interesting story or a story to tell. There are these other things happening in the world that are going to take precedent because they are news of the day and they are impacting a lot of people. Yeah,
and what do you guys think this year? I think there's quite a few elections that are going to steal a lot of that again, as it has happened in the past. So just being thoughtful, patient, and creative. That's what I know you guys try to bring.
Yeah. And I think, thankfully, I think TV stations might also recognize that there will be some fatigue around election coverage and will want to get other stories told. And just anytime we're pitching a story, we're also thinking about where it should go, right? And I think sometimes clients have a very good grasp on what outlets will cover their story and the various audiences that different TV outlets and print outlets, online, and there are so many different places that your story can go now, even within the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities metro. And sometimes I have a really good grasp on who's going to have interest. And sometimes you got to kind of nudge them and say, this story is going to be a really good fit here because of their audience and because of who your audience is. It might not be the best fit in the Star Tribune, for example, or a local TV station. Even though they have the largest audience, you can get to your audience here.
Which is their own social media channels or their own website even at times. So helping them determine, where does this actually fit into the puzzle, that, if it isn't going to be something that ends up on the 6 or 10 o'clock news, doesn't mean that it's not a worthy story to tell. It's just that's not the right channel to tell it in sometimes.
You don't have to wait for the TV station or for the newspaper to say, we'll cover this.
Yep.
You can get it out now.
Yep.
So we're living in this time where it's harder to know the right channel, which we work hard on doing for our clients. But looking ahead, what are you excited about in communications? Obviously, so you've listened to past episodes. David was on and he talked to us about AI, which can feel overwhelming for everyone and also brings with it a lot of neat opportunities too. And we know that technology has totally changed the game in media and in our work and allows us more ability to target with it. So what are you excited about in the future when you think about communicating and where we are today, but what could come, or how to grasp it?
I'm excited about the diversification of ways that we get our news. It also causes us some stress, right, within this industry, is figuring out exactly where to put out a client's story. But there are so many different ways now that you can get a story told in a more targeted fashion, which we often talk about. And I think there are going to be new spaces, especially within social media, where breaking news is going to be told better with the sort of unraveling at Twitter/X. And there's a space for a new online social town hall of sorts, where you get the most instantaneous breaking news, whether it's sports, politics, local news. And eventually I think something's going to emerge in that space that takes the torch forward.
In those spaces, though, I think this is the one thing that's really scary, is you've got all these new spaces and channels for news that people actually need to know about to be told, but it also opens up the opportunity for so much fake news to be told as well, which is, I mean, it's terrifying. Like with AI, I think AI is fascinating, but I'm also just as terrified of what it can also do at the same time.
Well, yeah, and because we don't have a arbiter of truth who says this is true, this isn't true, we're dealing with different realities based on who's taking what facts and what facts they deem to be facts. And so some of that stuff is still getting worked out in a way that you do, in a lot of ways, have to have multiple sources to be able to validate.
Yeah. I think the good news is that there is a reckoning going on in the misinformation space. I mean, from Congress to local legislators to the public and even social media companies, they're all taking it seriously. And most of them are taking it seriously, I should say. And looking at what can be done within their respective platforms, or from a legislative standpoint, to make it so that we're reining in a lot of the disinformation that's out there.
Yeah. What do you guys think about video as a platform too? Especially this week, there's been some news around TikTok. We'll see where that flashes out. But I don't think that video's going anywhere in terms of its importance. How important do you think video is becoming as its own social platforms and also mode for storytelling? Obviously, you come out of the world, but it hasn't always been the way, especially we would have previously, 10 years ago, relied on news media to capture the coverage, and it's become a lot more part of our work as well. How important do you think video is going to be as we move forward?
I think video is probably king until you can go into the metaverse.
Yeah.
Which I half joke. I don't think there's going to be as much appetite for the metaverse as some people probably anticipate there will be. But I think more and more people want to be informed and entertained via video and anything they can get on here, as opposed to scrolling an article for what will take a lot longer than watching a video.
Well, and video is just more interesting overall than reading a bunch of words. So I know, there's a lot of news sites that are changing their focus, like TV aside. TV's always been focused on video, but there are a lot of news sites that are now making video more the focus of their storytelling versus the versus the long form articles. I don't think the long form articles will ever go away, but they're reaching a different audience with the visual elements.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about omnichannel for all things. All stories, if they have elements that can be video versus audio versus the written version. In many ways, our job is now to try to think about all of the ways that we can package those things that fit within what a client is trying to do. And do you find that that's harder, or is that more fun because you're getting to think more broadly than just a press release or something like that?
Harder to think about all the different channels that are out there and figure out which ones we're going to do.
Or just thinking about what's useful for this client based on who their audience is and what that audience we've identified is important for their ability to take in the story.
Yeah, it requires more problem solving and brainstorming as a team.
And work in general.
And work in general.
Yeah.
As you sift through the different options at the onset of a project to figure out which route you're going to go. But I think as long as I've been around here at Tunheim, we've been considering a pretty vast array of channels and tactics.
Yeah. I think because I'm in a role where I'm mostly talking to people at the start of an engagement, a lot of the time I think when people think media relations, they still think in the more traditional realms of a press. We just need a press release. I hear that a lot. And then I have to say, okay, but what are you looking to do?
Yeah.
What is that going to do for your business? Trying to understand what are we trying to achieve as opposed to that thing, because as you guys are noting, oftentimes we have to think more broadly than any one tactic and in that strategy.
I think too, sometimes clients, with there being so many ways to tell stories, they think that, okay, this means you can reach out to the media more often. And it's like, no, you still don't want to pepper the media with a pitch and a press release and phone calls. I mean, most reporters and producers don't even answer their phones anymore. But I think there's a tricky balance of trying to still help clients realize, like, just because there are all these stories to tell and ways to tell them, you still have to be strategic on the other end of things to make sure you're not trying to tell stories that really aren't interesting just for the sake of telling stories.
Should we talk about allergies today?
We probably should.
Jason. We started this talking about allergies. It's that season.
They were so good for so long.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really true, though. Well, you bring a lot of really excellent, varied expertise, which is important. I mean, as we're talking about what a neat thing about what we do is really problem solving and then thinking about all the ways communications can affect that. And I think that's the world that we live in. And so any advice to people who are thinking about being in communications or making a switch to that about the hats that you wear when you're working with clients here?
Yeah, I think the point you made is a really good one, that going into this industry, you want to be a creative problem solver and someone who knows how to look at a challenge and sift through it and find creative solutions. You probably also want to be a good writer, a great communicator, but there are so many different roles you can play within this arena, through digital, through truly just writing, through podcasting, through the consulting work we do. But if you're someone who can solve problems and find creative solutions, you're going to have a route somewhere within all those different avenues.
Oh, that's great. So if there's one thing that you know now that you did not know or realize you needed to know 5.5 years ago when you started out here, what would be that one thing?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot.
I know. We didn't prep you with this one.
Wow. I might need to take home some homework.
Hey, that's fine. You can get back to me.
Go ahead.
This is mostly evergreen, but you're working on something really timely that's fun. And with your love of sports, the Big Ten women's and men's basketball tournaments have been in Minneapolis the last week, this week. You're in the middle of the men's, so thanks for taking a break from that to join us on here. What are your favorite things about working with the media on sports-related engagements like that?
I think one thing that's great about local sports coverage is it's not always about this team didn't execute right in the final 4 minutes, or they didn't shoot their free throws well, something like that. It's about the impact for the community. You look at the Big Ten women's basketball tournament, and I watched video after video of fans, young and old, saying what a tremendous example and leader Caitlin Clark is for the next generation, for boys and girls alike. And not just her. There are amazing athletes across the Big Ten and across collegiate athletics who inspire the next generation to be leaders, to be athletes, to make an impact at their school or in their community. And so I think that's what's special about sports, truly, for the fans and the community around it. And that's something that, in general, when we're working with local media, that's what they want to cover. Why does this make a difference for people here in the Twin Cities? They captured that during the women's tournament. And for both tournaments, I think they've captured what a difference this makes for business in town. Because having an event like this where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people come, that's a huge difference for restaurants and hotels and for lots of people who run small businesses. And the vibe downtown has been awesome. So that's what's exciting about sports, really, to me.
Yeah, and the fans in the Big Ten are amazing too, and the camaraderie that even though we each have our teams, even though you're competitive in that sect, you can still show up and cheer for the other teams and see the benefits of our programs all lifting each other up. I mean, the Big Ten has a lot upcoming, a lot of change upcoming that some people like me are sad about in some ways, because I have so much affinity for the Big Ten, and yet there's a lot of really cool opportunity for that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stratification within our society. Politics and other things have people on opposite sides, and thankfully with sports, we have something that can bring a community or a crowd of people from all different backgrounds together, and 20,000 of them, 80,000 of them for a football game will come together and do something together in unison. And it's a beautiful thing. Yeah.
What do they always say? It's sports and music.
Yeah.
That bring people together like that. So
makes sense. We got to hold on to these happy things we can do and do in our lives. Well, I know that you still got a weekend ahead of you of Big Ten, but that'll be exciting to see what happens through the rest of the tournament. The women's championship was one of the most fun days I've had in a long time. I'm not an Iowa fan. I'm not a Nebraska fan. And I still thought it was one of the best games of basketball I've watched in a long time. And so hopefully the men bring the same excitement this weekend too.
It's a high bar to clear.
Yeah,
it is.
That's so true.
Pretty incredible games.
Yeah. Is there anything else we haven't covered today that
about being understood?
Yeah.
Well, you asked me what I didn't know 5-6 years ago.
Did you already think of something?
Well, I mean, I think I know a lot more about being understood, to be honest.
Yeah.
That's kind of a generic answer. But what it takes from a communication standpoint, and the fact that you can consider all these options to reach, we've talked about for the last hour, that there isn't one silver bullet, but there are a million things you can do to reach the people you need to reach and be understood the way that you need to be understood.
Well said.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jason.